In this video, I'm going to be talking about how to think about burdens and contradictions when you're judging a debate. Basically, what we'll go through in this video is firstly a chat about what burdens actually are and how to identify them, and then thinking about what role they can play in your adjudication. And then secondly, we're going to be thinking about what a contradiction actually is and how to judge them. So what are burdens of proof? A burden of proof is a logical step that a team has to prove if they want to win a debate or an individual argument. For example, if you were affirming the motion that we should ban cosmetic surgery, you might need to prove that cosmetic surgery is bad, but you'll also need to prove that banning it is a good way of dealing with the problem and that it will overall improve the world. If you're negating the motion that we regret the norm that you should love your work, you need to prove that the status quo is better than the counterfactual world which would have arisen. So you've got to be comparative. Proving these ideas are essential steps in engaging fully and comparatively in a motion. How do you work out what the burdens are in a debate? The theory here is any argument essentially sets up a number of premises and they support an overarching conclusion. And this is true for an overarching case, but also for individual points. So here's an example. In the debate that we should allow pro-life organizations to pay women considering abortion to carry their pregnancies to term, affirmative needs to obviously overall prove that this policy will be beneficial. And that requires two main steps. Firstly, they'll need to prove that the policy has benefits. But secondly, they need to prove that those benefits outweigh any harms. Because obviously, if negative is able to prove that while the policy has some benefits, the harms outweigh them, then the policy is a net negative. So affirmative needs to both prove that there are benefits, but also be comparative. If the affirmative does not prove that there are benefits, or if there are benefits but the policy is bad on net, then they're probably going to lose the debate. So we can kind of think of burdens as often being correlated with the type of motion that you're debating. So we'll go through some common ones. Firstly, if you have the kind of debate that says that we should do something, then the burdens are for the teams to show that the policy is a net good or a net bad. So affirmative needs to show that the policy will be overall a good thing, and negative needs to show that it will be overall a bad thing. If we have a motion which reads that and then a statement, so for example, that the UN does more harm than good, the burdens are for teams to show that that statement is true or false. So affirmative needs to explain that it is correct and negative needs to show that it is not correct. And they'll also need to explain that their concept of truth is the right one. So you might have an argument between the teams about what it actually means to have done more harm than good. If you have a debate which the motion is that we regret something, then affirmative must show that the world as a whole would be better in that thing's absence, and negative needs to show that it would be worse. So that kind of debate is not just, is whatever it is that we're regretting a good or a bad thing? It's actually requires us to be comparative with some counterfactual world. Next up, that an actor should do something. So that North Korea should open itself up to foreign investment. I don't know. In that kind of debate, the team should show whether the world is better or worse if the actor does or does not do the policy. You don't need to think about what that actor cares about, whether it's actually like in North Korea's incentives to do it. You have to show that it's overall a good idea. So it's kind of similar to that we should debate. Then the final type of topic I've got here is that as actor, we should do something, that as North Korea, we would open ourselves up to foreign investment. In this kind of debate, the teams must show that the policy is or is not in the interests of that actor. So it's not, is it good for the world as a whole? It's specifically, should this person or this institution want to do this? How do we think about burdens in our adjudication? I think there are three main things we can do. Firstly, sometimes teams make claims about what their burdens are. So it's useful to kind of fact check this and think through whether actually they do or do not need to prove that thing. So for example, if a team claims it's not our burden to discuss a counterfactual in this debate, but you kind of do think they need to be comparative, then you can debunk that claim about their burdens. Secondly, it can be useful when deciding what's important or what should be prioritized. So it can help you zero in on the things which actually help a team win or lose. And thirdly, it can help us adjudicate clashes by working out what the benchmark is that teams need to reach or to come out on top. So for example, if we had an active debate about Joe Biden, affirmative didn't really successfully prove that Joe Biden would making some choice would help him win future elections, but they have proved that Biden doesn't particularly care about future elections, then they can still win the debate because their burden isn't necessarily to show that Joe Biden wins everything ever, but because it's an active debate that he as an individual is benefited in some way. What if neither team meets their burdens? Sometimes in a debate, both teams don't really prove what they need to prove in order to win the debate. So for example, your affirmative doesn't prove that their model actually solves the problem they've identified, but the negative doesn't prove that the model has any harms. So at that point, you might kind of be like, meh, the teams seem pretty equal, neither has really proved all that much. In this instance, you basically just need to find some marginal difference. So that could be like, neither team has really proved a very significant harm or really prove the problem is solved or worsened, but maybe there is a small external harm or benefit, something like a social message or the way people have used political capital. Alternatively, maybe there's a principle. So maybe the policy has very few impacts, but it's something which is just principally right, in which case we might still support it. All right, moving on to what contradictions are. So a contradiction occurs when a team makes two conflicting claims which are mutually exclusive. So here are some examples that I've seen in recent high school debates. So one team claims that cancel culture is really rabid, it's really irrational, it ruins people's lives. And then they turn around and say, but also cancel culture doesn't actually work because all you have to do is just a simple apology and then you're forgiven. These two claims can't really coexist because if cancel culture is so forgiving, it's probably not as life-ruining as they claim. So those two characterizations don't sit together very effectively. Similarly, in debates about jails, you might hear jails have really bad living conditions, they're really awful for prisoners, and then a little bit later, but also we're wasting money on providing prisoners with all these luxuries. Again, those two characterizations don't really stand. So oftentimes these contradictions are going to come out when a team has two conflicting pieces of characterization. What is not a contradiction? Sometimes people claim things are contradictions when they're not actually. So analysis of different effects on different stakeholders does not count as a contradiction because obviously the same policy can affect people in different, even contrasting ways. For example, you might say for celebrities, cancel culture is useless and lacks impacts. But for ordinary people, it really is life destroying. And that allows perhaps that affirmative team to have it both ways if they're saying cancel culture is bad. Alternatively, sometimes you have even if rebuttal, where the team might say something like, well, we think that cancel culture destroys people's lives, but even if our opposition claims that actually people can be forgiven and actually it's not that impactful, then we think that cancel culture in that instance doesn't really produce many benefits or social change. In that case, you're not contradicting yourself, you're making one claim which you think is true, and then you're saying, even if that isn't true, here's an alternate claim which would still stand, right? So that doesn't count as a contradiction. So you shouldn't assume, like just because a team has kind of two conflicting or contrasting claims, just make sure that they're not just applying to different stakeholders or they're not even if rebuttal. How do you deal with contradictions when you're adjing? Well, essentially, teams which have internal inconsistencies shouldn't be getting full credit for both points. Then they're kind of benefiting actually from those that contradiction, those two characterizations. So there are a couple of different ways that the contradiction could go depending on the debate. Maybe it's the case that both claims have become less persuasive as a result, so you kind of view them as mutually undermining each other. Or maybe only one remains persuasive. So you're willing to believe one characterization, but the other one and the argument attached to it must be discarded. So you can decide that based on how you ultimately see those two claims being persuasive. And the other team might have some responses about which scenario they consider more likely. So they might tell you which one they think that you should consider more, and you can weigh those in your judgment as well. Okay, so I hope that this video on contradictions and burdens of proof has been helpful. Basically, the thing to remember is when you're adjudicating, make sure to take the team's claims as seriously as possible. Don't assume necessarily that they're contradictions. Don't apply burdens that you think they should have to meet upon them. Make sure that we're dealing with what the debate actually requires them to prove, and that we're thinking critically about the kind of claims that teams might make about their burdens and about whether the other team has made a contradiction.